You're listening to The Resilient Animal. I'm Annie Peterson, Doctor of Education with a Master's in Mental Health Recovery and Trauma-Informed Care. This podcast is an exploration of how helping other living beings can benefit human mental health and well-being, and what makes us all resilient animals. Welcome, everyone. Today we're going to talk about something that might seem, at first glance, quite small. Today, we're going to talk about words, specifically the words we use when we talk about animals. The pronouns, the euphemisms, the idioms, the casual turns of phrase we've absorbed so thoroughly that most of us have never once stopped to question them. But here's the thing about language. It is never truly small. Language is the architecture of thought, the words we choose, or the words we fail to choose carefully, shape not just how we communicate, but how we perceive. They quietly construct our assumptions about who matters, who has interiority, who deserves consideration, and who does not. When we call an animal they, we are making a philosophical claim. When we say someone is a guardian of a dog, we are making an ethical claim. When we say a beloved companion received humane euthanasia, we are honoring a profound truth. And when we choose not to say we will kill two birds with one stone, we are, with full awareness, declining to invoke an image of casual violence against creatures who have done nothing to us. Language evolves slowly, and we are all, in some sense, inheritors of the words our culture handed us. The question is whether, once we become aware of what our words are doing, we are willing to do the quiet, steady work of choosing differently. That is what this episode is all about. It's about thinking carefully about the language we use for animals and to consider how small, deliberate shifts in that language might reflect and reinforce a more thoughtful, more honest, more compassionate relationship with the other beings who share this world with us. Let's start with something that might feel almost simple, the word it. In English, it is the pronoun we use for objects. For things without personhood, without interiority, without a self that matters in any morally relevant way. We say it for a chair, for a rock, for a car. We say it for things we have no particular relationship with, things whose inner lives, if they have any, are not a concern. And for a very long time, we have said it for animals. Not always, not universally. When someone speaks of their companion dog, they almost always say he or she. They've given that dog a name. They know that dog's personality. They've looked into the dog's eyes and seen something looking back. The pronoun shifts naturally, intuitively, because the relationship has made the animal's personhood visible. But for animals we don't know personally, for the raven sitting on a fence, for the fish in a tank at a restaurant, for the cow standing in a pasture, the default pronoun is almost always it. And what that pronoun does, quietly and continuously, is reinforce a particular way of seeing those animals as things rather than beings, as objects in the landscape rather than subjects with their own experiences. This is not a trivial distinction. Philosophers and cognitive scientists have spent decades exploring what we mean when we talk about subjectivity, about having a point of view, about there being something it is like to be a particular creature. These animals have nervous systems capable of registering pain and pleasure. They have social relationships, preferences, fears, and what we might reasonably describe as interests. They are not objects, they are subjects. And yet our pronoun says it. When we shift to he, she, or they, something changes, not just in our sentence, but in our attention. We begin, however subtly, to grant the animal in question a kind of standing. We signal to ourselves and to our listeners that this animal is someone, not something. We invite a slightly different quality of consideration. The science of animal cognition is not uniform across all species. We don't fully understand the inner life of an oyster in the same way we understand the inner life of an elephant. There are genuine, honest debates about where and how consciousness manifests across the animal kingdom. But our uncertainty itself is a reason for the more expansive pronoun, not the more dismissive one. When we genuinely don't know whether a creature has subjective experience, erring on the side of they rather than it is the more ethically cautious choice. We lose very little by extending that grammatical courtesy. We potentially gain a great deal in terms of how we orient ourselves toward creatures whose inner lives are far richer than we've assumed. Practically speaking, this shift is not always seamless. English hasn't settled on a comfortable singular they for animals in the way it has in recent years for people. Some people use he or she based on the animal's sex when known. Some use they as a neutral singular. Some find it awkward at first, then natural within a few weeks of practice. There's no single right answer to the grammar, but the intention behind the choice to treat the animal as a being rather than a thing is what matters most. Let's talk now about a word so common, so embedded in both everyday speech and in legal frameworks that questioning it can feel almost radical. The word owner. I am guilty of using this word, so I completely understand how difficult it is to remove this from your lexicon. We speak of dog owners, cat owners, horse owners. The language of ownership is everywhere in the world of animals. In veterinary clinics and animal shelters, on license applications, in newspaper stories and casual conversation. And it reflects something real. In most legal jurisdictions, animals are classified as property. You can own a dog in the same legal sense that you own your couch. They are, under the law, things. But you already know, if you've ever lived closely with an animal, that this doesn't capture the reality of the relationship. A dog is not a couch. A horse is not a piece of furniture. The beings we bring into our lives and our homes are living, feeling, thinking creatures with their own needs, their own preferences, their own experiences of comfort and distress, joy and grief. They are not possessions. They are companions and family members. The word owner quietly encodes a set of assumptions. It implies that the animal exists for our benefit. The word implies that our rights over the animal are primary. The word implies a relationship of dominion rather than a relationship of care. And perhaps most dangerously, it can subtly license neglect or mistreatment. After all, if it's my property, who is to tell me what to do with it? Now, I want to be clear. Most people who use the word owner are devoted, loving, responsible caretakers of their animals. The word doesn't determine the relationship. People's hearts and actions do. But language shapes culture, and culture shapes behavior over time. When we shift the language, we shift slowly, incrementally, but genuinely the framework within which we understand our responsibilities. Several animal advocacy organizations and some municipalities have begun to move away from owner in favor of terms like guardian, caretaker, or simply companion animal guardian. These words carry different freight. Guardian implies responsibility, stewardship, the prioritizing of another being's welfare. A guardian is someone entrusted with care, someone who acts in the interest of the one in their care, not just in their own interest. This is a more honest description of what most of us actually aspire to in our relationships with the animals in our lives. We want to be good guardians. We want the beings in our care to thrive, to be well, to live lives that are as full and as comfortable as we can make them. The word guardian honors that aspiration. The word owner subtly undermines it. Some people push back on this shift. They argue that language is just language, that what matters is how you treat the animal, not what you call yourself. And there's definitely truth in that. But consider how much energy we spend in other contexts on the words we use to describe relationships and responsibilities. We understand that calling someone a partner rather than a subordinate changes not just the word, but the dynamic. We understand that naming things carefully is part of respecting them. The same logic applies here. Others worry that abandoning the language of ownership undermines legal protections for animals, that if we're not owners, we lose standing to advocate for animals in legal contexts. This is a genuine concern worth taking seriously, and it's one reason why the legal and linguistic shifts need to happen together, thoughtfully, over time. But the solution to that concern is to improve legal protections for animals, not to preserve a linguistic framework that casts them as property. For now, in your own daily speech, consider making the shift. Instead of saying, the dog's owner, try the dog's guardian. Instead of saying, I own 2 cats, try, I live with 2 cats, or I care for 2 cats. These small adjustments open up a slightly different way of thinking about what you owe the beings in your life. And that slightly different way of thinking, practiced consistently, can quietly change quite a lot. There is a particular kind of linguistic kindness intended to soften difficult truths that ends up doing a kind of harm. Not a cruelty, not a malice, but a harm nonetheless. The harm of obscuring reality in ways that prevent us from fully reckoning with it. I want to talk about one of the most common examples of this in the world of animal care, the phrase, put to sleep. This is definitely one that I am always trying to move away from. This phrase is used almost universally in contexts where an animal is euthanized. It is meant to be gentle. It is meant to ease the grief of the moment, to soften a devastating experience with a softer word. And I understand that impulse entirely. Anyone who has sat in a veterinary clinic holding the body of a beloved companion or has made the agonizing decision to end an animal's suffering knows that the moment calls for gentleness. But put to sleep is not a gentler word. It is a fundamentally different word. Sleep is temporary. Sleep is reversible. Sleep is something you wake from. When we say an animal was put to sleep, we are, whether or not we intend to, encoding a kind of denial. A softening so extreme that it verges on untrue. The honest phrase is humane euthanasia. And I want to spend a moment with both words in that phrase because both of them matter. Humane is important because it signals intention. It tells us that the decision was made out of compassion, to end suffering, to spare a living being from pain and distress, to choose a peaceful death over a prolonged dying. Humane euthanasia is not a casual act, it is a profound one, undertaken out of love and responsibility. The word humane honors that. It is, in fact, one of the most merciful things we can do for an animal who is suffering beyond recovery. It is something not to be ashamed of. It is something not to hide behind softer language. It is an act of care, and it deserves a name that reflects that clearly. When we use the honest phrase, we allow ourselves to grieve honestly. We allow ourselves to make decisions honestly. We allow ourselves to have real conversations with our veterinarians, with our children, with ourselves, about what it means to hold responsibility for another life and what it means to choose a good death on their behalf. Another word, and this is a huge pet peeve of mine, it's difficult in its usage, is the word fixed. Many adults use this word in order to avoid explaining to a child what a spay or neuter is. And then those children grow up to be adults who continue using the word. The animals that are in your care are not broken. So using the word fixed is misinformation about the procedure. Simply put, a spay or a neuter are simple operations that prevent a female or male animal from producing babies. These procedures are not only to help reduce pet overpopulation, they also help to prevent different health and behavioral issues that some pets may have. The same principle, calling things what they are, applies across many other contexts in the world of animals. Euphemisms in the realm of animal agriculture are so widespread that we often barely notice them anymore. Processing, used in place of slaughter. Harvesting, used in place of killing. Production units, used in place of living animals. Each of these phrases does the same work as put to sleep. It puts a comfortable distance between the word and the reality, and that distance can make it harder to think clearly about what is actually happening. I'm not suggesting that every conversation about difficult realities needs to be brutal or clinical. There is a time for tact and a time for directness. And navigating that balance is part of what it means to communicate well. But there is a difference between tact, which acknowledges the reality while being sensitive about how it's communicated, and euphemism, which replaces the reality with something else entirely. The first is a kindness. The second is a disservice, both to the beings whose experiences are being obscured and to ourselves as agents trying to navigate the world clearly. So the invitation here is this. When you encounter a word or a phrase that seems designed to make something more comfortable than it is, pause and ask what the accurate word would be. Not to be harsh, not to be unfeeling, but to be honest with yourself, with others, and with the animals whose realities those words are describing. Now, let's talk about the larger concept of speciesism. Speciesism, the term used by philosopher Peter Singer in his 1975 book, Animal Liberation, and since elaborated by many thinkers in animal ethics. It refers to the assumption that one species, typically humans, is inherently superior to all others, and that this superiority justifies treating members of other species in ways that would be considered deeply wrong if done to humans. It is, at its core, a form of prejudice, a system of thinking that assigns moral value based on species membership rather than on the morally relevant characteristics an individual actually possesses. Now, I'm not going to spend this time debating the full philosophical terrain of speciesism. That's a rich and complex conversation that would take many episodes to do justice to. What I want to focus on here is something more specific: the way speciesism shows up in everyday language, often without our realizing it. Consider the word pest. We use it to describe animals whose presence we find inconvenient. Mice on our walls, pigeons on our balconies, raccoons in our garbage. But pest is not a biological category. It is a relational one. It describes not what the animal is, but what the animal is to us. A mouse, from the mouse's perspective, is simply trying to find food and shelter and warmth. The fact that these needs bring the mouse into conflict with our preferences doesn't make the mouse lesser. It makes the situation more complex, and it calls for responses that might include discouraging the animal's process without denying the animal's status. When we call an animal a pest, we short-circuit that complexity. We tell ourselves a story in which our preferences are the only ones that matter, in which the animal's interests don't register at all. That story can then license all manner of responses that, if we thought about the animal as a being rather than a nuisance, we might choose differently. Or consider the phrase just an animal, as in, it's just a dog, get over it, or they were upset about a spider, it's just an insect. The word just is doing heavy lifting here. It's a word of dismissal. It is saying this being's experience, this being's life, this being's death does not warrant the level of feeling you are bringing to it. And embedded in that dismissal is an assumption that being an animal rather than a human means your experiences don't count, or count so much less that they can be brushed aside. But why should that be? Why should the fact of being a different species reduce the moral weight of suffering? Pain is pain. Fear is fear. A dog in distress is distressed. A chicken confined in conditions that prevent any expression of natural behavior is experiencing something. The just in just an animal is not a logical conclusion. It is a cultural habit, one that can be examined and, with practice, set aside. Speciesist language also shows up in the way we name and frame scientific and philosophical discussions about animals. For many years, the academic default was to describe animal behavior in terms that carefully avoided implying subjective experience. Animals didn't feel fear. They responded to stimuli. They didn't grieve. They exhibited separation behaviors. They didn't play. They engaged in non-purposive motor activities. This language was designed to seem rigorously neutral, but it was in fact loaded. It presupposed that animals don't have inner lives, and then constructed its descriptions accordingly, making it almost impossible to see what was plainly visible. The field has shifted significantly in recent decades. In 2012, prominent neuroscientists affirmed that non-human animals possess the neurological substrates that generate conscious experience. The thing that most clearly illustrates how deeply our relationship with animals are is embedded in the fabric of our language, even in places we would never think to look. And those are called idioms. An idiom is a phrase whose meaning, collectively understood, is different from the literal meaning of its words. When you say you're going to beat around the bush, you don't mean you're going to beat an actual bush. When you say something costs an arm and a leg, you don't mean literal limbs or changing hands. We understand idioms as figures of speech, as colorful shorthands for ideas, and we use them without giving much thought to the images they invoke. The images matter. And a surprising number of the idioms most deeply embedded in English invoke violence against animals, often quite casually, often in ways that, if we slowed down to think about them, we might find less comfortable than they initially seem. Killing two birds with one stone. We've all said that. It's a perfectly useful phrase for describing the satisfying efficiency of accomplishing two goals at once. But it is, on its face, an image of killing birds, of throwing a stone at birds in order to kill them. Why should that image be our default metaphor for efficiency? Of course, the image is simply there because it has always been there, inherited from centuries of common language, and we've stopped seeing it. But we can start seeing it again, and once we do, we might choose differently. Some people have proposed alternatives. Feed two birds with one stone is a good option. Same phonetic structure, vastly different image. Instead of killing, we're feeding. Instead of a stone, we're offering something good. The meaning remains the same. The rhythm is almost identical, and the image has been transformed from one of casual violence to one of generosity. It's a small thing. It's also a delightful thing. Let's consider a few more. There's more than one way to skin a cat. Yuck. This phrase, meaning that there are multiple approaches to solving a problem, is another one that, once you slow down and look at the image it's calling up, might give you pause. Alternatives abound. There's more than one way to solve a puzzle. There's more than one path up the mountain. There are many ways to bake a cake. All of them convey the same idea without invoking the image of harming an animal. Beat a dead horse. That one's been around forever. We use this phrase to describe the act of continuing to argue a point that has already been settled, to keep pushing an argument that has run its course. This image is of striking an animal who is already beyond pain. An alternative, going in circles or rehashing a settled question, neither invokes an animal at all. So, I'm not suggesting that we need to purge animal idioms from the language entirely, or that using an animal idiom makes someone a bad person, or that we should spend our conversations in a state of anxious linguistic auditing. That kind of approach tends to make people defensive and ultimately does more harm than good to the cause of thoughtful language use. What I am suggesting is something gentler. Awareness, the practice of noticing, the occasional low-stakes choice to reach for an alternative when one presents itself, and when the context makes it easy. The willingness to offer a reframe with humor, with lightness, with warmth, rather than judgment, when the opportunity arises. Because here's the thing about idioms. They change all the time. Language is not static. Phrases fall out of fashion, new ones arise. Images that once seemed natural to begin with now may seem strange, and strangers adopt new figures of speech until they become more native. The idioms we use are not laws of nature. They are habits of community. And habits, as we all know, can change. Everything we've talked about, pronouns, the language of guardianship, the honest words for difficult realities, the speciesist habits embedded in everyday speech, the idioms we've never examined, all of it requires practice, not a one-time decision, not a dramatic announcement, not a performance of virtue for an audience, just the quiet, daily, incremental practice of choosing words more carefully. Language is one of the most powerful tools we have for sharpening and dulling the vision of how we treat animals. When we call an animal it, we are, however slightly, dulling our vision of them. When we say they were put to sleep, we are, however gently, looking away. When we describe someone as an owner, we are orienting toward possession rather than care. And when we repeat, without examining, the idioms that treat casual harm toward animals as a natural and unremarkable image, we are allowing that naturalness and unremarkableness to settle deeper into our bones. Language is not everything. It is not a substitute for action, for policy change, for the hard structural work of building a world that treats animals with genuine consideration. But it is something. It is the place where our thoughts take shape. It is the medium through which we share our values and our vision. It is, at its best, an act of ongoing attention to the world and to the other beings in it. And careful, sustained, loving attention is perhaps the most foundational act of care there is. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. I hope something in this conversation stays with you. And I hope the next time you speak about an animal, you find yourself, for just a moment, choosing your words a little more carefully. That moment is enough. That moment is where it all begins.